Welcome to the Brick Podcast, produced here at the Brick Store Museum in Kennebunk, Maine. Bricks construct our communities and link past, present, and future. Here in Maine, bricks can be found in our town halls, our sidewalks, our schools, our cultural institutions, our courts, our homes, and our fireplaces. As cultural metaphors, bricks can describe our strength, a brick house, our suffering, hit like a ton of bricks, our frustration, hitting a brick wall, our determination, brick by brick, and our way home too. Just follow the yellow brick road. As bricks weave through our community and our culture, this podcast will do the same.
My name is Cynthia Walker. I'm the Executive Director here at the Brick Store Museum and the host of the Brick Podcast. In this episode, you'll hear news and updates from the museum and an oral history citizen spotlight with the owner of Home and Away Gallery in Kennebunkport, David Shultz. Prior to the show, I want to say a special thanks to our business members who support this continuing programming through museum membership. That's Clark Insurance, Deering Lumber, Houston and Company, Old House Parts, Well Housed, Home and Away Gallery, Huzzy Seating, Weir's Buick GMC, and Duffy's Tavern and Grill. To sign up as a business member, which offers benefits of museum membership to all of your employees, including free admission to our museum, as well as over 900 other museums across North America. It's always good for a vacation. You can visit brickstoremuseum.org/support and learn a little bit more about it. Individual members interested in taking advantage of that free admission I just mentioned to over 900 museums across North America can also access this benefit by joining us as a sustaining friend. That's more information on our website right at the support page. Coming up here at the museum, June 1st sees the opening of our summer exhibit called The Art of Mending, which is guest curated and installed by Illustration Institute based in Portland, Maine. After this past year, we invite you to come explore the three-dimensional art of mending. With relaxed state guidelines, the museum now welcomes guests without a reservation, as capacity is no longer limited. We're still asking everyone wear a mask, however, while you're inside the exhibitions for the safety of young children and unvaccinated visitors. This also means we'll be hosting hybrid events for this summer and fall. So for those of us who love the ease of access of virtual programming, we will have those things. And for those of you looking forward to gathering in groups again, we're planning some great in-person events too. All of our upcoming events can be found on our website. When you go to the homepage, there's a little calendar button right at the top left-hand corner and you can see what's coming up. One item that the staff and board of the Brick Store Museum are working on behind the scenes is our strategic plan for the next 5 years. We get to take an in-depth look at where we want the museum to go and how we can reach wider audiences. We need your help to do this. If you are interested in being part of the community planning team, please email me at cwalker@brickstoremuseum.org. This Citizen Spotlight was recorded in November 2020, during which I sat down across the Zoom screen from David Shultz, owner of Home and Away Gallery in Kennebunkport. David's story is exactly why Citizen Spotlights are so special. Every person has an incredibly interesting story about their lives and how he or she has lived it, and David is no exception. Like last month's podcast, I'll just note that because this was recorded over Zoom during the pandemic, there was a bit of background noise. At the time of the recording, David and his wife Anne were doing as many parents and grandparents did during the pandemic. They were caring for young children who were learning from home. Without further ado, here is David. David, if you would start with our starting question, just to give everyone some context for your life, what generation will you consider yourself a part of?
Baby boomer.
And tell me about your first name. Where does it come from?
One of my mother's relatives had been named David, and in the Jewish tradition, you tend to name children after a dead relative, not a living relative. So I'm pretty sure that's where it came from.
And tell me a little bit about where you grew up and what you remember most about it.
Sure. So I grew up on the island of Puerto Rico, first in the city called Arecibo, and that's about 50 miles west of San Juan. Lived there for about 10 years, and then moved to San Juan, lived there for about 5 years. So what do I remember about it? Well, I remember that the weather was nice year round, and we were able to play outside, baseball, basketball, ride bikes, do whatever we wanted, go to the beach sometimes. And, in that regard, it was a very, very special experience. The, of course, I grew up speaking Spanish as well as English. And that experience was different, but to me, it was just kind of natural. So today, compared with many other Americans, I seem to be in the minority of people that speak two languages somewhat fluently. So that's kind of a different and interesting aspect that came from where I grew up.
Wow. Yeah, I would say so. If you don't mind me asking, how your parents obviously were living there. Were
Yeah.
they born there, or what was the story? Why?
No. So my father was born in Germany, and he left Germany just before World War II to escape the Nazi regime. And my mother, so he first went to Palestine and then moved to the New York area in around 1940 or so.
Wow.
And yeah, his parents had left Germany at a different time. They all got back together in New York. And my mother was born in New York. Her parents had come there in 1921. So she was actually, and that was the year she was born. I think her mother was pregnant. So my mother can be considered a first generation
Yeah.
or whatever. She could be considered an immigrant, and my father was definitely an immigrant. But in any event, so my father's family had a brush manufacturing business. They decided to open a factory in Puerto Rico in 1948 when some new laws were passed to make it more attractive for American companies to open
Oh, wow.
operations in Puerto Rico. It was called Operation Bootstrap, and essentially any profits from the Puerto Rican operations were not taxable.
Oh,
So that's when they moved there, and I was born 3 years later.
very good. You lived there, am I forgetting 10 years?
10 years in a city called Arecibo, and then another 5 years in San Juan.
Wow. Okay. So when you were younger, what toy do you remember playing with?
A few things come to mind. Bicycle, playing basketball. We had a basketball hoop in the yard, and playing cowboys and Indians. So,
Oh, yeah.
cowboy hat and a gun with caps and cowboy boots.
And I skipped the question, actually. So you were talking about your parents.
Yes.
Do you have any siblings?
I do. I have an older sister, Barbara, an older brother, Jeff, who passed away a couple of years ago,
Oh,
and
wow.
a younger brother, Ken.
Wow. It's
So
a
four
nice
of us,
family.
yeah.
Tell me something that you know about your ancestors. It can be anything.
Okay, so this is a story that it's kind of family lore. It's somewhat been confirmed, but there are some sketchy details. But it was Romania in World War II. So my grandfather's brother, this would be my father's, I'm sorry, mother's father's brother,
Hmm.
remained in Romania. His brother, my grandfather, had left in 1921, but the brother was still in Romania, living in a town where he was something like a police constable,
Hmm.
and his name was Philip Blumenfeld. So the story goes that he was alerted to some children that they'd been let go in the woods. I think it was in Russia, and I don't know if they had been on their way to a concentration camp or something.
Oh, wow.
And it was near the end of the war, and the story goes that they were just let go in the woods and they were left to survive on their own.
Yeah.
And so my great uncle Philip somehow got together some money, took a train, and found a bunch of these kids and brought them back to their town, and had them taken care of, adopted by other families, and so forth. So he stayed in Romania, and from some documentation that we've read, he became a member of the Communist Party, and stayed there until mid 1960s. And he had wanted to move to Israel, but his wife never wanted to. So when she passed away, he went.
Wow.
And he was going through customs and immigration, and the young man there looked at his papers and said, could you go sit over there, please? And a little while later, the young man brought him into an office and said to him, are you Philip Blumenfeld, who rescued some kids from, I get a little broken up with this, so sorry,
Yeah. No,
from the forest? And he said, yeah. And so the young man was one of the kids he had rescued.
that's amazing.
Yeah. And that part is fairly well documented. Because one of my aunts who lived there had spoken with Philip and confirmed that part of it. So that is pretty amazing.
Oh, that's
The
a
most
great,
interesting story I
that's a
can come
great
up with.
story.
Yeah.
It's a great story of somebody doing something good and then being remembered for it, which is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Wow. So actually, this leads to the next question. What made you come to Kennebunkport? I'm sure there was a kind of a journey after Puerto Rico.
Yeah, so we had been living in Newton, Massachusetts. I had gone to college in Massachusetts and stayed there for most of the time. So I graduated college in 72, and for between 72 and 2002, when we moved to Kennebunkport, I mostly lived in Massachusetts. And then when I got married, we continued to live in Massachusetts, except for 4 years in San Francisco.
Wow.
And and I spent a couple of years in New Hampshire, but that was way back when. So I had been working for a large financial services company in the Boston area for about 10 years or so, and I just wanted to really change not only careers but scenery.
Mm-hmm.
And decided to open up a Native American arts gallery, which I still run, Home and Away Gallery, and was looking for a place outside of the Boston area to do that, and searched everywhere from Rhode Island to probably as far as Bath, Maine, and really fell in love with Kennebunkport. And we were fortunate that we were able to do that in 2002.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So it's been 18 years, I suppose. What made you, when you mentioned you were obviously wanted to open up a Native American art gallery, what got you interested in that?
Well, when I was 14, my family took a trip we often took trips to New York in the summertime. And that year, 1965, I guess it was, we did a driving tour and drove upstate New York and then into Canada. And in southern Canada, somewhere in Ontario, I first saw some Inuit sculptures. And, they were fairly common back then, fairly inexpensive and fairly common. And they really, somehow, I was attracted to them. I mentioned I have 3 siblings, and none of them remember seeing them.
Oh.
So, one of these unexplainable attractions that grabbed me and didn't really touch them. And so I stayed, they kind of stayed with me for years. And then I was exposed to Native American art from the Southwest a few years after that. And again, that kind of stayed with me. And I started collecting these things much later, and also in looking for another career, came upon this through a process of exploration, and thought, well, gee, it would be nice to be surrounded by this work. And to be offering these items that I love to other people.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened.
And certainly you now get to, I assume, well, not this year, but travel around to different parts of the country, and certainly Maine, to be able to meet different artists.
Yep, that's right. Ordinarily, we would go to the Southwest in March. First week of March, there's a big Native American art show in Phoenix, Arizona at the Heard Museum.
Okay.
And so we did that for years and years. and didn't do it this year. Actually, it wasn't really the pandemic that caused it, but I had other plans, and I've skipped a couple years. This would have been
Yeah.
a year that I would have skipped anyway. So yeah, get down to that show, and there are somewhere around 800 artists there, and just get to walk around, meet them, see their work, talk to them, see some demonstrations, and so forth. And then in Maine, there are the Maine Indian basket maker shows, of which I usually go to the one in December. In past years, we have also stayed in the Southwest and traveled around and visited different artists in their homes and
Oh, wow.
studios. Yeah, so it's been fun. And also, when I was writing the book, Baskets of Time, we traveled around in northern Maine primarily and visited with artists and interviewed them. And so that was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I would think so. Once you start thinking about it, it's really about or interacting with people, I'm sure.
Yeah, on both sides, on artists as well as
Yes. These are kind of questions about our kind of shared humanity. So tell me about a time that you were scared.
Scared. Can we skip this for now, and
Yeah,
maybe something will come to mind, and we'll come back to it?
certainly.
Okay.
So can I pose you the opposite question, or not so opposite, but do you have a memory of a time that you were happy?
Well, lots of happy times, but probably the most striking one is when my son was born. I have two stepdaughters who I consider my daughters, but I wasn't there at their birth. And my son was born at home in 1978.
Wow,
And so, you know what? I'm going to fold that right in because that was both probably the scariest time as well as the happiest time.
sure, that is understandable. And does he live around here?
Yeah, so he lives in Farmington with his wife and daughter, and that's where we are right now. We're spending time trying to keep our granddaughter on track with her remote learning. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but we're spending a few days a week up here. I've been doing it for about a month, and we'll do it not every single week, but we'll continue to do it to try and help out during the pandemic.
That sounds fair enough. Nice to be near family as well at this
Absolutely.
point. Okay, so moving on to a couple of kind of your own culture questions. Do you have a favorite book?
Same as Bill Clinton's 100 Years of Solitude
Oh,
by
nice.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez,
Very
which
good.
I read in English. I haven't tried to read it in Spanish, but I may someday.
Oh my gosh. What was the first movie you saw in the theater, if you remember it?
Would have been in the 1950s, and I don't remember if it was an animated Disney cartoon or some kind of live feature film. I suspect it probably would have been an animated film that I would have seen when I was 4 or 5 years old. But Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, I don't remember who it was.
Do you remember your first car?
Unfortunately, I do. I had a Volvo, a 1968 Volvo model number 142S, I think.
Wow.
And it was a lemon. It was a real lemon, and I had tons of problems with it. So I have never considered buying a Volvo since then. I'm sure they're very good cars, but with my bad experience, it has just steered me away from them altogether.
That's fair. Do you have a favorite song?
No, but if I think of one, I'll let you know.
Okay. What did you want to be when you grew up?
I when I was in elementary school, I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up. I mentioned before being outside a lot, and I always liked just poking around in the grass and in the trees and picking fruit from trees and just finding out more about nature.
Yeah.
That changed mostly when I took a biology class in 8th grade, I think, and realized that my love of nature didn't translate to a lab environment. So, so at that point, I kind of switched gears.
And I should have asked this before because you noted that you went to college in Massachusetts. And then you worked in the financial industry. Did you major in that in college?
No, I didn't. I actually majored in art.
Oh.
And for about 3 years, shortly after I graduated from college, I was making jewelry.
Wow.
And yeah. So I did that, and that helped to also reinforce my love for Native American jewelry. Not that I was making Native American jewelry, but I really admired it.
Yeah.
So that was another factor. Since we sell a lot of jewelry now, it sort of brings back that love for that craft and my admiration for the incredible talent that people have that, they apply to that work, talent and creativity that, I probably never would have achieved. So I then went back to graduate school and I studied finance in graduate school.
Okay, nice. Wow.
Yeah.
And where did you live in Massachusetts?
Mostly in Newton. In college, I lived in Waltham primarily because I went to Brandeis University. When we lived there as a couple and as a family, it was mostly in Newton with 1 year in Wellesley, Mass.
Oh, fantastic. This is going back away, but talking about jobs as well. What was your first job?
Paperboy. I had a paper route in San Juan and I rode my bicycle around. At that time, we lived in a condominium that was, I think, 12 stories. So my route was right around there in different buildings. I would ride my bike to the different buildings, take the elevators, and drop the
Oh, wow.
drop the newspapers off. And it usually was pretty uneventful, except for the time where I was kind of trapped by a dog on the third floor of a building in
Oh,
the
geez.
elevator. It might have been the second floor, I don't remember. And I had to jump off second floor of the building to
Oh my
the
gosh.
ground. I know. Well, I thought it was a German Shepherd. That was scary. Maybe that was my
Yeah,
scariest.
that does seem very scary. Wow. What was school like for you?
Well, I was always a good student, except when I was misbehaving. Started doing in my teenage years, but I always got good grades, and it wasn't something that came super easy. Some people get good grades not doing a lot of work. I always had to kind of do the work, do all the homework in order to be able to do well. So it was, pleasant enough, but hard work.
Sure. When you moved from Puerto Rico to back to the
Mainland.
mainland United States, was that in the middle of your schooling?
Yes. So I went to White Plains High School for 11th and 12th grades.
Oh, wow. So that always, the transition in high school always seems like it would be a difficult one to move in the middle of a school year, or not school year, but a kind of a
Yeah,
form
yeah.
in your life.
Yeah, that was actually not a good time in my life because my parents were getting divorced at the same time. So it was a
Oh,
very
wow.
stressful time. Yeah, moving from a school that was about 350 kids from kindergarten to 12th grade
Yeah.
to a school that was almost 2,000 kids
Wow.
for just high school,
Right.
10th, 11th, and 12th. So not one of the best periods of my life.
So this one, this question might bring up a lot of different ones for you, but I wonder if you can tell me about a piece of art that resonated with you. And you already spoke about the Inuit sculptures, but was there another piece that you're thinking of?
Yeah, so when I was in school, in college, studying art, my favorite artist was and probably still is Henri Matisse.
Oh, yes.
And I remember being at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, I'm pretty sure it was, and I saw a painting, The Dancers, that I had seen in books many times. But when I saw it in person, and it's, I don't know, maybe 12, 15 feet wide and, 8 feet tall, I mean, I just sat there in total awe and really, really enjoyed it and took it in. And so that was one of my most memorable experiences with
Wow.
seeing art. Yeah.
When did you first use a computer?
San Francisco, and it was sometime between 1978 and 1982. And the Apple computer, Apple II, I think, had just come out. We decided to buy one I was in an accounting department at that time, decided to buy one for the accounting group. So somewhere in that period. Yeah.
So you spoke, this is kind of going forward a little bit, but you spoke about the, I guess, cultural practices of your own family kind of being handed down. Is there anything that you now pass on to your kids and grandkids?
Well, it's interesting because we were a blended family. The women who I consider my daughters, didn't grow up. They were kind of Catholic, but not really practicing. My wife grew up Catholic, and my son grew up Jewish. So he went to Sunday school to learn that aspect of our culture, and he is passing some of it on to his daughter. So it's kind of like some of the rest of my life. kind of a, I don't want to use the word twisted path in a negative way, but kind of a curvy path of going in different directions. And so some of it is being passed on to my granddaughter. One of our daughters considers herself Catholic. The other one is kind of neutral, circuitous path. That's the word
That's
that
the word. I like that.
I should have used. Yeah. Yeah.
And I have this memory, and this might be me forgetting, but I think you said to me once that, and recently, that you had gone back somewhat recently to Puerto Rico. Is that right?
Yes, we have been. Well, let's see. We went one time and a couple of times in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it was about 20 years. So I reconnected with some junior high school and high school friends through Facebook, and I'm just trying to remember here. So we've been back there twice, I think, in the past few years, and the last time was earlier this year. And got together with these high school friends and did
Wow.
some touring and, just having nice times together. Didn't spend enough time at the beach, but some time. And, did some bird watching with friends, interesting restaurants and things like that. And, for me, it's kind of a double memory hit because I'm remembering places as well as friends.
Yeah.
And for Anne, my wife, it's meeting new people who she now is somewhat familiar with and seeing new places. And it's just been a really wonderful experience in spite of we were there shortly after Hurricane Maria a few years ago, and the island was very devastated by that. And, at that time, any tourists that they could get, they just totally welcomed with open arms, and they still do, but it was especially important for them back then to have people come to the island and, spend money.
Right.
And then this year, shortly before we went in January, there were a number of earthquakes there. And so Anne was very concerned about going, but we went anyway. And the parts of the island that we were on, they weren't near the places that suffered the most damage, but we did drive through some of them. And again, it was good to be there to spend money and help the economy, which had suffered from the earthquakes.
So we're on my last three questions, which kind of are all over the place, but I'll ask them anyway.
Sure.
War touches most of our lives in one way or another, sadly. How are you related to it? And of course, there could be many ways, but.
Well, so I already told the story about my great uncle in World War II. I've been very fortunate to not be directly touched by war in my lifetime. I know my parents lost relatives in World War II that obviously I never met because I was born after World War II, and they never talked about that much. But I know that there is loss there, and I would have had a lot more relatives had it not been for World War II.
Right.
Aside from that, again, I've been very fortunate. I was in college, and then I got a high draft number when the Vietnam War was going on. Haven't had any relatives go to war and have any bad things happen. So again, very fortunately, not been directly touched by war.
That's always a good thing. Although I suppose the World War II.
I was just going to say too that that war obviously affected the family in not just in loss, but in coming to the U.S. to live. That, in a funny way, is a good thing because we're living here and living a good life.
Too right. Yes. So good out of bad. What is one thing you wish for to happen in the future?
So it's okay to talk about politics then, right?
Sure.
So yes, the past almost 4 years to me have been tragic for this country. Again, we've been very fortunate in not suffering from any financial difficulties or also very fortunate in that no relatives of mine have been affected by COVID that I'm aware of. But if I can diverge, I have been working as an interpreter for 2 or 3 different nonprofit legal organizations, and I have been to a detention center in South Texas and worked with immigrants there. And then earlier this year, just before things locked down, it was early March, first week of March, I went to Los Angeles and interviewed a number, probably 6 or 8 children immigrant children from Mexico and Central America who are in group homes of one kind or another. they knew where their relatives are. They know where their relatives are, either parents or uncles and aunts and so forth. And they were in these homes waiting for their relatives to get permission to be reunited. And, that's very different from what we're hearing today, 545 children who don't know where their parents are. These children did know, and most of them were doing fine. Places that we visited, schools, were very good and I think caring about the children, but still they're separated from their parents. Of the 6 or 8 kids that I met personally, I don't know how many of them succeeded in being reunited.
Yeah.
So that is part of my hopes for Biden to be elected, because I hope that he is elected, and I hope that he can change a lot of the immigration policies that our current president has put in place. That have led to these really tragic circumstances. Some of the adults that I have spoken with are probably going to be deported. Some of them are almost certainly going to be in situations where their life is at risk. And that's not going to end when our current president is out of office, but I hope that it will be greatly mitigated. So that's my great wish for this country and for people that are trying to come here to escape from danger and to create better lives for their children.
Right. That's amazing. So I'm going to skip my last question because I'm hoping that you might expand. How did you get involved with going to the detention center or out to LA to interpret?
Yeah. So again, it's a little bit circuitous. In Phoenix, I had stayed at an Airbnb that was owned by a young woman who's an attorney. And she eventually she had been a public defender in Phoenix, and she subsequently left that, went back home to Georgia where she grew up, to Atlanta. But she and I stayed in touch. My wife Ann and I visited her briefly in Georgia. And anyway, she had posted on Facebook that she was going to a detention center in Texas to help immigrants. And, she's an immigration attorney, so she has a lot of experience with that. But I sent her a note and said, do you think that they can use people who speak Spanish who are not attorneys? So that's how I became connected with this organization, CARA, C-A-R-A, Pro Bono, an organization of attorneys who have been working at the South Texas, I'm trying to remember the exact name, South Texas Residential Center or something. And because it's in Dilley, Texas, we just call it Dilley. And so they have been bringing volunteers into Dilley to help immigrants through their credible fear interviews to try and get their stories, so that when they have a credible fear interview, which determines whether they are going to be allowed to come into the country, to be let out of the detention center, come into the country and start the immigration process, which for men takes 2 or 3 years. But the outcome of their credible fear interview can determine whether they are allowed into the country or whether they're sent back to their own country or the third country. And so I went as an interpreter with an attorney who happens to live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the first time around. And, I interpreted for her, but she did, she sort of drove the interviews, but we worked as partners. And before that and after that, I was also doing telephone interpretation for attorneys who were down there who didn't have an interpreter with them. I went back between Christmas and New Year's last year and conducted the interviews myself at that point. And the difference in what was going on down there was just striking. The first time I was there, we had about maybe 97% success rate in getting people through their credible fear interviews, because they were fleeing gangs, and the gangs are literally deadly down there. And, so about 97% of them were allowed to come into the country. By the time I went back a year and 2 months later, in December of 2019, the success rate in getting them through the credible fear interviews was, I don't know exactly, but somewhere around 20%, let's say 15 to 20%.
Wow.
And it's because of the changes to the immigration procedures that were put in place by this administration. And I won't go into details about those, but just a striking difference. So many more people are being sent back, and credible fear is the first interview, is the first step. If they get a negative ruling on that, then they can appeal for 2 more steps.
Oh, wow.
And so when I was there in December, I was mostly working with people who had received a negative ruling on their credible fear interview and were preparing for their appearance before a judge, an immigration judge, to see if the judge would, vacate that ruling and allow them into the country or not. And they would have to take the 3rd step of appeal, but there's not much success in that. And what I found out was that the success or failure in the appearances with immigration judges was mostly based on the judge themselves.
Oh.
Some judges were very liberal and some were very strict.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the cases were not decided based on merit, as far as I'm concerned, but rather on the judge's, proclivities toward immigration. So, talk about another unfair part of the system. If you got a good judge, most likely got let out. And if you didn't get a good judge, then you had no chances of being let out, no matter what your story is.
Wow.
So, yeah, very, very twisted. This is, I used the word twisted earlier. This is a very twisted in a negative way process that I hope changes.
Right. Yeah.
As a result of my work with the Cara Pro Bono group, who have what they call the Dilly Project, I got on a mailing list for immigration attorneys, and I found out about another opportunity with another organization, Center for Immigration Justice and Constitutional Law, I think it is.
Okay.
And they work exclusively with children, and that's how I got connected, how I got the ability to go to Los Angeles in early March to interview the children. There was a ruling in, I don't remember the year, it was called the Flores Agreement.
Okay.
And in the Flores Agreement, there are certain conditions that immigrant children who are being held in custody without their parents, certain conditions have to be met, including they have to get schooling and they have to get counseling and so forth.
Oh,
and, and they have to have an advocate to try and help them to get back together with their parents. So in monitoring this Flores Agreement, this organization sends volunteers to schools all over the country, but primarily on the West Coast and in the Southwest, to check on conditions in these schools to make sure that there's compliance with the Flores Agreement. So that's how I got connected with that.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for filling that in. I was wondering if you could give your, not final thoughts, but some thoughts on why empathy is important and where we might all get that from.
Wow, that's a tough question. And by the way, I have not thought of a favorite song, so we might just skip that one altogether. But I'm only stalling now because I'm not sure how to answer this question.
Maybe I'll reframe it, and this is coming from my perspective, but perhaps you could speak to why you think history is important or not important, why that matters.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to sort of frame it so I can think about it differently. So, I mean, we've heard about so many different times in history when people have been oppressed, genocide has taken place. We talked about the Holocaust a little bit in connection with my family, but in connection with my current work, the genocide of Native Americans and Eskimos, Inuit in this country has been going on for a long time, since Columbus arrived on these shores and people were enslaved and people were brought down by disease, and Native American populations were either essentially imprisoned or wiped out by disease, or wiped out by having to take these long walks to new places that they were being told they had to go to. I guess all those things, come into play in my thinking, but to make a more direct connection, I think that both my parents kind of instilled in us a sense of empathy for people who were less fortunate than we were. So I think it's kind of all rolled in together. The history of the Holocaust in my family, my interest in Native American art, all sort of growing or coming from the empathy that my parents instilled in us. And I think that, I think my siblings also share that. That's another indication that it came from my parents.
Yes.
And so how do we translate that to empathy goes a long way towards making this world a better place. And the lack of empathy in, the immigration policies that I already talked about, for example, to me, destroys lives, creates very, very negative environment that harms and even kills a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So my being tries to sort of counter that in whatever ways I can. It might be a small impact, it might be an impact on a small number of people, but I do what I can to bring more empathy into the world, again, to try and make it a better place. And I guess that's about how I would think about it. I hope that answers the question appropriately enough.
That certainly answers the question, at least for me, because that's what I believe too. And it's certainly been really pleasant to hear, your story. And I will say at least from an overview, it makes total sense why you obviously have done all the things that you have done. So it's not quite as circuitous, but
Okay, thank you.
Everything makes sense about why you do the things you do. And I appreciate you sharing all of those things with me and this recording.
Well, listen, I really appreciate that you asked me to do this, because I think oral histories are good, they're important, and I'm happy to share it with you and with the museum.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Brick, brought to you by the museum's proud business partners. Questions, comments, and topic suggestions can be emailed to info@brickstoremuseum.org. Please tune in to next month's show to dive into more Kennebunk history, art, and culture. And to learn more about what the museum does year-round, please visit our website at www.brickstoremuseum.org.